All right, we'll get started. Good evening, and welcome to the Center for Studies in Religion and Societies Thursday public lecture. My name is Catherine Chan, and I'm the acting director of the CSRS for the 2022-23 academic year. I'd like to open tonight's lecture by acknowledging and respecting the Lekwungen peoples on whose traditional territory we are notionally holding this lecture, although our speaker is elsewhere tonight, and the Songhees, Esquimalt, and Wasanich peoples who have continuing historical relationships with the land on which the University of Victoria is situated. I'm very pleased this evening to introduce the first lecture of our winter lecture series, Dr. Jim Cohn. Jim is one of our associate fellows at the CSRS this year. He completed his PhD at the University of Chicago. He has also been a tenured tutor at St. John's College and was a founding faculty member of Quest University in Squamish. He's made valuable contributions to various conversations that we had over the fall and the summer at the CSRS. And I look forward to hearing his thoughts on sin and salvation and Faust. So thanks for being here, Jim, and I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Catherine, and thank you for the acknowledgement. I appreciate that. I want to talk about selling your soul to this afternoon or this evening. So welcome, everybody, for all those of you who are contemplating such a thing. The Faust legend is, of course, a myth, and myths are like skeletons. And since they are a kind of imaginative pattern, they change their shape when different authors endow them with a body. From time to time, cultures necessarily reinterpret their foundational stories. The Faust legend is a story of a scholar who exchanges his soul to the devil in the afterlife for knowledge and power in this life. It has shown noteworthy plasticity and flexibility. It's fair to say that it touches something quite deep about power, evil, and human aspiration. Next slide, please. Can we go to, yeah, thank you. This evening, I'd like to look at the Faust tale in 4 famous instantiations. It first appeared as a German chapbook in 1587, known as the Faustbuch by Johann Spies. Within only 5 years, the Faustbuch was translated into English as the history of the damnable life and deserved death of Dr. John Faustus. These 2 versions are quite close, and for convenience, I'll only deal with the English version of 1592. Slide 3, please. Second version, Christopher Marlowe's, taking his inspiration from an early translation of the popular German legend, Marlowe wrote a tragedy entitled Dr. Faustus that appeared on the Elizabethan stage in 1590. His play is a classic of English literature. Third, in the center of your screen, Goethe developed his own take on the German legend, publishing his version of Faust in 1808. Goethe's Faust is the classic of German literature. And finally, I looked at Thomas Mann's novel, Dr. Faustus, on the right of your screen, which appeared in 1947. It takes up the problematic issues of the soul of modern Germany and of the artist as the Faustian type. There are other renderings of this legend, of course, very many, but these 4 are very famous. Next slide, please. Let's talk about the original Faustbuch first. The first Faustus chapbooks were published in Frankfurt in 1587. They tell the story of a shadowy but apparently real person, Georg Faust, who lived between 1480 and 1540. Curiously, these dates correspond almost exactly to Luther's lifespan. Funny Freudian slip. The Faustian notion depends on some important ways on the Reformation and changes in thinking about salvation. This original Faust was an academic charlatan, a magician, a quack healer. The Faustbuch put an enhanced version of his story into print, telling of a university scholar who, despite his success, prefers necromancy to theology. By his powers of conjuration, Faustus summons Mephistopheles from hell in order to make the devil his servant. Mephistopheles promises to do anything he asks and bring him anything he wants in this life. In turn, Faustus signs a contract in blood, the blood, of course, being a travesty of the blood of Christ, which seals the covenant of the Eucharist. Faustus agrees to give himself to Lucifer after death. The chapbook is a transparent morality tale with little subtlety. It openly tells the reader not to follow this sinner's bad example. The title of the English translation lays the blatant moral purpose bare, the history of the damnable life and deserved death of Dr. John Faustus. What more do we need to say? In its genre, it reverses the popular Catholic medieval lives of the saints. The Faust story is the life of a sinner. One commentator writes, the very idea of a pact with the devil originates in the portrayal of Christ's temptation by Satan in the book of Matthew, which ends with Christ's refusal. The essential structure of the adventure formula of the saints' lives has not changed. It's merely inverted. Now this is the adventure formula of a sinner's life. In the chapbook, Faustus uses his magic for flying around Europe, playing stupid pranks on the Pope, which I guess got a big laugh out of the New Lutherans, and producing dumb shows portraying Helen of Troy and Alexander the Great for his friends. He's given chances to repent, but fearful of the devil's threats, he never can bring himself to do so. When his time is up, Faustus is punished horribly, his body ripped apart in some detail, and his soul is dragged down to hell by a triumphant devil. The reader is strenuously encouraged not to do this at home. The paradox, of course, is that the reader nonetheless gets to indulge in the fantasy of being granted unlimited power and knowledge and watching with some schadenfreude when it doesn't work out well for the poor doctor. Thus, we get the original Faustian bargain, or selling one's soul in exchange for worldly mastery. Next slide, please. Christopher Marlowe must have read the English translation of the Faust book in some early version, for his tragedy Dr. Faustus was performed on stage in London in 1590. It follows the plot points of the English translation fairly closely. And here are the opening lines of Marlowe's prologue. Of riper years to Wittenberg he went, whereas his kinsmen chiefly brought him up. So soon he profits in divinity, the fruitful plot of scholarism graced, that shortly he was graced with doctor's name, excelling all whose sweet delight disputes in heavenly matters of theology. Till, swollen with cunning of a self-deceit, his waxen wings did mount above his reach, and melting heavens conspired his overthrow. For falling to a devilish exercise and glutted more with learning's golden gifts, he surfeits upon cursed necromancy. Nothing so sweet as magic is to him, which he prefers before his chiefest bliss. And his chiefest bliss, of course, would be the salvation of his soul. Now, on the one hand, the prologue promises a straightforward morality play. A man who receives a superior education at Wittenberg, which is the Lutheran university where, by the way, Hamlet also studied, excelling at divinity and disputation, he makes the bad choice of using his cunning for magic. The drama features angels and devils who appear on stage and try to persuade the protagonist toward good or evil. The funny thing is, we're meant to take these characters as quite literally real. Commentators say that the Elizabethan audience would have accepted as fact that angels and devils were actively engaged in the human world in a fight for souls. This motif lives on for us in the cartoon characters of little angels and devils perched on someone's shoulders, right? I mean, you know these cartoons. And the one says, yes, 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 and it says, no, no, no. But on the other hand, the prologue also hints at tragic themes. The myth of Icarus invoked here commonly served as the ancient model of the aspirations of a clever mortal who exceeds his earthly bounds and suffers the consequences. Stylistically, too, in the passage, you can hear the English iambic pentameter verse, so well suited to serious tragedy. Marlowe and Shakespeare, by the way, were contemporaries, born in the same year. And Shakespeare takes this verse form just a couple of years later and starts writing all of his tragedies in the next 10 years. So taking the theological themes seriously and expanding upon them, Marlowe elevates the tone and the content of the original Faust book. He dwells on the questions of sin and repentance, especially whether a sinner who has knowingly persisted in his sin can somehow oblige God to forgive him anyway, as if challenging God to prove his infinite mercy. Now, this idea of being able to challenge God, the greater the sin, is as old as Romans 1, where Paul says, "Shall we continue in sin that grace may abound?" And the idea there was that the worse the sin, the greater the mercy. Now, the core of the problem is a damned if you do, damned if you don't paradox of Calvinist theology. In Marlowe's play, Faustus elaborates on his decision to turn to magic, and he starts reading the Latin Bible. So let me quote. Stipendium peccati mors est. Stipendium, etc. The reward of sin is death? That's hard. Si peccati negamus fallimur et nulla est in nobis veritas. If we say that we have no sin, we deceive ourselves and there's no truth in us. Why? Then like we must sin and so consequently die. We must die an everlasting death. Well, what doctrine call you this? Que sera, sera. What shall be, shall be. Divinity, adieu. These metaphysics of magicians and necromantic books are heavenly. Lines, circles, schemes, letters, characters. These are those that Faustus most desires. Oh, what a world of profit and delight, of power, of honor, of omnipotence is promised to the studious artisan. But his dominion that excels in this stretcheth as far as doth the mind of man. A sound magician is a mighty god. Here, Faustus, try thy brains to gain a deity. This passage invents a psychological moment that the original chapbook does not have. The divinity professor runs up against a theological paradox. We are fallible mortals and cannot escape sin. The wages of sin is death. It's impossible for anyone to earn grace from God. Earning grace is the important part here in Calvinist theology. And Faustus concludes from these givens, these Calvinist givens, that he is predestined to damnation no matter what he does or how hard he tries. So he renounces the study of divinity as useless. Might as well embrace magic, he concludes, and stretch one's powers to the limits of the human mind. That's his real ambition, to stretch his powers to the limits of the human mind. Now, as it turns out, Marlowe's Faustus is more interested in knowledge than power. After they sign their contract and the devil is obliged to answer his questions, the very first thing Faustus immediately asks about is God, hell. He wants the real scoop about the Copernican model of the heavens, and he especially wants a book of botany that displays all the plants and trees on Earth. So it doesn't sound very evil to us, and in fact would sound more like science to our ears. So like his chapbook predecessor, Marlowe's scholar never does very much evil with his magic powers. He performs the same party tricks for his friends. Evil and power end up running out of interesting things to do. Magic, that is, back in 1590, boils down to what we would think of as technology. 400 years ago, remember, this was considered diabolical. And today, these tricks are commonplace. We fly around Europe at will. We eat grapes in January, which are tricks that he performs. And of course, we never think twice about the magic of such things. But then, as now, as the critic Clem Brooks points out, command over the means of nature does not give us any insight into human ends. Marlowe's Faustus caps his sins by insisting that Mephistopheles give him Helen of Troy as his paramour. And of course, for many, many centuries, Helen of Troy was considered, of course, the paragon of human beauty. And when she appears, Faustus exclaims, in maybe Marlowe's most famous lines, "Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilion? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss." And they kiss on stage. Her lips sucks forth my soul, see where it flies. Now, this last line is no metaphor. Faustus knows Helen is merely an illusion produced by the devil. When they kiss, when Faustus deliberately consorts with a succubus, it was shocking. His persistence in his association with the devil and his refusal to repent condemn him. His last moments are indeed poetic, but they're tortured, for he truly fears hell, and he fully understands the consequences he has invited. Unlike the chapbook, which is merely moralizing, Marlowe's play is properly a tragedy because of the inherent contradiction between what Faust wants to know and wants to do and the sacrifice of his soul required to get it. Next slide, please. Let's turn to Goethe's Faust. So traveling English actors brought Christopher Marlowe's play to the courtly stages of Germany. And over the course of time, this is quite funny, but it's quite true, this play migrated into the puppet theater, which was a fairly popular form of entertainment. Now, Goethe first saw the Faust puppet show as a child, and he had a puppet theater in his home. Goethe also read the German chapbook at an early age. He did not read Marlowe's play until much after he had read or composed his own Faust. In his 20s, he drafted the original romantic core of his Faust play, which is mostly the love story. And he returned to this draft of the romantic core when he was 40. He expanded it and published as a fragment when he was nearly 50, and then worked on it some more and published Faust, the first part, when he was nearly 60. He then worked on an entirely new second part, only allowing it to be published after his death at 82. And like most readers, I am primarily interested in the first part. But what's interesting here is that this legend was Goethe's preoccupation throughout his entire life from his 20s until his death. Now, Goethe's interests are much less theological and far less moralizing than those of his predecessors. Goethe is not interested in the problem of sin and repentance, the nature of hell, or the paradoxes of theology. Conversely, he is interested in human striving. Moreover, he was a dedicated natural scientist and did not think that the study of nature was diabolical. In fact, Goethe actually thought that his scientific writings would be much more important than his poetry, which turned out to be a huge mistake on his part, but nonetheless. Goethe's Faust is by far the best known work of German literature. Every single German high school student reads this. You will hear references to it in ordinary newspaper articles, everyday conversations, and in scholarly works. Knowledge of it is indispensable for educated German readers. Faust is for German what Hamlet is for English. We instantly get the reference when we hear to be or not to be. For German speaker, the same is true for innumerable verses of Faust. Now, like the main characters of the Faust book and of Marlowe's play, Goethe's professor reveals himself discouraged after decades of studying books, accumulating university degrees, and teaching partial truths. His opening monologue expands greatly, however, on the reasons for the scholar's frustrations. And here's the brilliant English translation of the beginning by David Luke. You can find this in the Oxford World Classics, by the way. Well, that's philosophy I've read, and law, and medicine, and I fear theology too, from A to Z. Hard studies all that have cost me dear. And so I sit, poor silly man, no wiser now than when I began. They call me professor and doctor, forsooth, for misleading many an innocent youth these past 10 years, I suppose, pulling them to and fro by the nose. And all I see, that our search for knowledge is in vain. This burns my heart with bitter pain. I've more sense, to be sure, than the learned fools, the masters and pastors, the scribes from the schools. No scruples to plague me, no irksome doubt, no hellfire or devil to worry about. Yet I take no pleasure in anything now, for I know nothing. I wonder how I can still keep up the pretense of teaching or bettering mankind with my empty preaching. How can I even boast of worldly success? What fames or riches do I possess? No dog would put up with such an existence. And so I'm seeking magic's assistance, calling on spirits and their might to show me many a secret sight, to relieve me of the wretched task of telling things I ought rather to ask. to give me a vision of nature's forces that bind the world, all its seeds and sources and innermost life. All this I shall see and stop peddling in words that mean nothing to me. Faust feels like a fraud. Knowledge itself is not what he imagined it to be. He knows nothing. Now, this conclusion ought to be a Socratic victory, but it doesn't feel like one to him. His pessimistic verdict about the limits of knowledge is consistent with the new philosophical view of Kant's Critique of Pure Reason, which appeared in 1781, when Goethe was 32 years old. Faust's rejection of philosophy and theology leads into nature as his object. Unlike his predecessors, however, Faust does not immediately summon up Mephistopheles to make his deal. Instead, he first conjures up the earth spirit. The earth spirit seems to be the cosmic chief operating officer. It has the job of managing nature. When the earth spirit appears, it says to Faust, "At times whirring loom I work and play. God's living garment I weave and display." In other words, God seems to be the CEO of the universe, and the COO makes manifest God's will, which is otherwise invisible. We witness it, we mortals, as the ebb and flow of life. Now, the earth spirit is far too powerful for this mortal, and he shrinks from it like a worm. And the spirit even mocks his pretensions by calling him an Übermensch, a Superman. Now, in this case, Übermensch is not a Nietzschean compliment, but it's an insult. Faust's ambitions do not correspond to his actual station in the cosmic hierarchy. Faust counters that his divine spark, his creation in God's image, puts him on an equal footing with his spirit. Now, the spirit squarely rejects such impudence. Just before vanishing, it says, the Germanist goes on to quote it, "Du gleichst den Geist, den du begreifst, nicht mir." And that means you are only equal to the spirit you can grasp, not to me. Humankind, because of its limited mind, will never be able to understand the seeds and sources of the cosmos. The earth spirit's put down devastates the magician. He is a worm. The vexation drives him to the brink of suicide. He's boastfully unafraid of death in the afterlife. He insists that there must be higher realms. If he can't find them in this life, he says, well, then bring on the next one. He doesn't go through with suicide because of the bells and choirs of Easter morning mass, and they revive him. Next slide, please. His despair nonetheless gets the attention of Mephistopheles. The devil knows that Faust is ripe for temptation. Mephistopheles is smart, urbane, ironic, witty, self-aware, and crude, everybody's best friend. He teases Faust about his high-flown ambitions. There is nothing funny at all about Marlowe's dour devil. But here, in Goethe, by contrast, the devil gets full rein to poke fun at mortal foibles. Faust and Mephistopheles do mirror each other. This is the spirit that Faust can comprehend and to which he is equal. This devil belongs to satanic middle management, a sort of regional director of evil for Earth. Now, when Mephistopheles appears, Faust asks him who he is. Mephistopheles says, "Part of that power which would do evil constantly and constantly does good." Faust. Well, this riddle has no doubt some explanation. Mephistopheles. "I am the spirit of perpetual negation, and rightly so. For all things that exist deserve to perish, and would not be missed. Much better it would be if nothing were brought into being. Thus what you men call destruction, sin, evil, in short, is all my sphere, the element I most prefer." Goethe put the romantic core he had drafted in his 20s into a bigger frame, one in which evil has a place. To make his frame, he parodies the book of Job and set a prologue in heaven in front of the drama. In the prologue, we see the Lord, like a king, appearing before his retinue of archangels. Mephistopheles drops in to pay court. In contrast to the songs of praise, which the archangels, of course, are always singing, Mephistopheles gripes that things on earth are as bad as ever, and the Lord challenges him on that point. The Lord, do you know Faust? Mephistopheles, the doctor, you mean? The Lord, my servant. He serves me, but still serves me in confusion. I will soon lead him into clarity. Mephistopheles, if I may be his guide, you'll lose him yet. I'll subtly lead him my way, if you'll let me do so. Shall we have a bet? The Lord, he lives on earth, and while he is alive, you have my leave for the attempt. Man errs till he has ceased to strive. Well, go and try what you can do. Entice that spirit from its primal source and lead him, if it's not too hard for you, to grasp on your own downward course. And then when you have failed, with shame confessed, a good man in his dark bewildered stress well knows the path from which he should not stray. Mephistopheles, no doubt, it's a short journey anyway. I'll win my wager without much delay. And when I do that, if I may, I'll come back here and boast of my success. The Lord, indeed, you may feel free to come and call. You are a type I never learned to hate. Among the spirits who negate, the ironic scold defends me least of all. Man is too apt to sink into mere satisfaction. A total standstill is his constant wish. Therefore, your company, busily devilish, serves well to stimulate him into action. Now, this bigger frame makes Faust's personal story a human tragedy, but the larger story remains a divine comedy. Faust does not know that God is betting on his inborn sense of right and wrong. This belief in the untaught but natural inclination to do the right thing smacks of the 18th century arguments about natural man, especially as Rousseau expounds them. The Lord speaks like a parent about children. They all try stuff, as they should, and therefore they make mistakes. Moreover, the Lord hints that the universal human vice is laziness. This new emphasis on the virtue of activity reminds us of the change in spiritual attitudes that Weber points out in his famous study, The Protestant Ethic and the Spirit of Capitalism. When Mephistopheles makes Faust his offer of service in this world for Faust's soul, in the next one, Faust scoffs at him. Faust, poor devil, what can you offer to me? A mind like yours, how can it comprehend the human spirit's high activity? But have you food that leaves one still unsatisfied? Quicksilver gold that breaks up in one's very hands? Can you provide a game I can never win? Mephistopheles, I shall perform as you instruct. All these delights I can purvey. But there are times in life, my friend, when one enjoys mere quiet satisfaction. Faust, if ever I lie down in sloth and base inaction, then let that moment be my end. If by your false cajolery you lull me into self-sufficiency, if any pleasure you can give deludes me, let me cease to live. I offer you this wager. Mephistopheles, done and done again. Faust, if ever to the moment I shall say, beautiful moment, do not pass away, then you may forge your chains to bind me. Then I will put my life behind me. In Goethe's version of the Faustian bargain, Faust doesn't want power, riches, or theories. He really wants unending desire, a carrot, forever dangling in front of him so that he will always strive onward. Faust bets that Mephistopheles will never be able to satisfy him with pleasures. He's not fooled by pleasures. Rather, what he wants are all the highs and lows of human experience, the totality of what it means to be mortal. Mephistopheles warns him that the apprehension of the whole is only meant for a god, because, of course, to perceive it, you would somehow have to stand above it. Faust doesn't seem to care, but here he overreaches. His aspirations to transcendence, which Goethe has grounded and made plausible throughout the first half of the drama, represent his noblest side. They are also the root of the tragedy. To become fully human, Faust paradoxically needs a supernatural boost. So the first and longer half of Goethe's play motivates Faust's bargain with the devil. Now, once their deal is sealed, Mephistopheles gives Faust a magic potion that makes him 30 years younger. In a magic mirror, Faust sees the girl of his dreams, and then Mephistopheles cleverly brings Faust to her. Unlike Helen of Troy, however, Gretchen is a believable, relatable, flesh and blood, innocent, poor, provincial Catholic German girl. For her part, Gretchen also has her own sweet Cinderella ambitions. With this dramatic setup, the second half of the play portrays their tragic love story. Now, for many readers, theatergoers, and opera fans, Gretchen's drama is the more memorable and charming part. Now, I would like to stress nonetheless how the love story takes place inside an epic frame. And by epic, I mean an imaginative poetic construction that spells out the human relationship to the gods and to their own mortality. Next slide, please. Now, Gretchen falls hard for Faust, imagining a new life with this rich, upper-class, educated, out-of-town suitor. She notices him immediately. She toys with him in her fetchingly modest way. They fall in love, but it quickly goes bad. So that they can spend the night together, the devil produces a sleeping potion that Gretchen can administer to her mother. She adds a few too many drops, however, and she kills her. When her brother comes home, he wants violent revenge for his sister's dishonor. He gets into a sword fight with Faust and Mephistopheles, and Faust ends up fatally stabbing him and having to flee the town. Gretchen, meanwhile, is pregnant, but Faust in exile doesn't know. To distract him, Mephistopheles drags his protege off to an orgy of devils and witches that bores Faust. Gretchen, in despair at having been seduced and abandoned, drowns her baby and lands in prison facing imminent execution. The climax of their love story comes in the very last scene when she refuses to flee prison with her lover and instead, renouncing the devil, accepting her bodily death, and begging the Lord for mercy on her soul, which the Lord grants. Next slide, please. So the love story is Goethe's addition to the Faust legend. Gretchen consistently steals the hearts of audiences. Goethe gives her several of his really finest poems. We do get the feeling of her love, her guilt, her torment, her despair, her repentance. And this young girl's touching human drama contrasts very sharply with the chapbook and with Marlowe's play. In those versions, Helen, who plays the same role roughly, is a very minor character. She never develops, and in fact, Helen actually never even speaks. Now, in love, Faust almost finds the infinite transcendence he was longing for. When Gretchen repudiates him in prison, it crushes him, for he loved her, but he knows that he's responsible for destroying her, her mother, her brother, and her baby. That the Lord saves her soul makes sense from a medieval point of view. She genuinely repents, and God is genuinely merciful. Now, it's no consolation for her unbelieving modern lover, however. The first part of the play abruptly ends on this point of Faust's tragic overreach. Years later, when Goethe picks up the story in part 2, the angels give Faust a second chance. They must first blot out his memory, however, otherwise his remorse would never permit him to continue living. Next slide, please. Let's turn to Thomas Mann. So his book was entitled Dr. Faustus, The Life of the German Composer Adrian Leverkühn as Told by a Friend. So in 1943, in his late 60s, Thomas Mann picked up the Faust theme for his panorama of Germany in the first half of the 20th century. He was all too well aware that any discussion of the soul of Germany had to ground itself on the Faust legend because of the enormous influence of Goethe's poem. Mann was Germany's preeminent man of letters, having won the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1929. When he publicly and vigorously opposed the Nazi Party, it forced him into exile in 1933. He wrote Dr. Faustus in Los Angeles. Exile literature had an uneven reception in post-war Germany. Now, those who remained in Germany suffered through years of terror and then through the destruction of their country. And they were not inclined to endorse criticism coming from someone who had not shared that suffering. The novel appeared in 1947 to a mixed reception. Some critics called it Mann's masterpiece, but it didn't fully seize the imagination of readers who were struggling to rebuild their country. Now, Mann interweaves two Faustian bargains here, one personal and one national. On the personal side, he takes up the life story of a gifted composer, Adrian Leverkühn, describing in detail his education in Lutheran theology at Wittenberg, and then later in music theory. He describes the whole social and intellectual world surrounding his life as a composer in Munich. The story is told as a memoir by his best friend, Serenus. Adrian, the composer, makes a personal Faustian bargain, but it's not an open deal with the devil, whom we are meant to understand as a real character. Instead, Adrian makes an artistic choice to drop his study of divinity and pursue music instead. He's highly conscious of the musical tradition that predominates in Germany. The difficulty facing a composer in the 20th century, or any artist for that matter, is to find a way forward that does not repeat the past. Next slide, please. So in an act of defiance against bourgeois expectations and his own mortality, Adrian deliberately sleeps with a syphilitic prostitute. The satanic bargain here is freely choosing a fatal illness, a decision akin to selling your soul. Disease is a means for Adrian to avoid ordinary mediocrity. Thomas Mann, like his character Adrian Leverkühn, and like many others 100 years ago, like Proust, for example, they strongly believe that sickness is more creative than health. The result of the genius-bestowing disease is Adrian's development of 12-tone music. Mann steals this real musical innovation directly from his contemporary Arnold Schoenberg. Adrian does meet the devil some years after contracting syphilis, but it takes place in a kind of delirium. It's hard for the reader to know if this devil is real or merely part of his imagination or a dream or what. But when Adrian asks him if he's real, the devil cleverly responds that he's real enough. It hardly matters if he exists or if he's merely a psychological element of the composer's mind. The result is the same. In any case, the devil spells out the terms of Adrian's bargain already sealed in his infected blood. And again, the blood comes back as a very important motif. So the composer will get 24 years of genius in return for his soul. Now, there's a crucial condition. Adrian cannot love. This limitation destroys a number of the people around him whom he could love, and the devil just kills them off in complicated subplots, which is the main content of the book. Now, after his 24 years are up, Adrian wants to perform his masterpiece for his friends, but as he speaks, he starts to confess his sins to them all, and his lecture degenerates into a crazy rant. He collapses, having lost his mind. Now, very much like Nietzsche, who suffered a similar syphilitic breakdown, Adrian survives for the next 10 years as a vegetable, unable even to kill himself. Mann, as a careful student of Freud, transposes the devil from something that was once understood as a fact of real life to a psychological phenomenon. The results of the bargain are the same. It's a personal tragedy for the Faustian character and a catastrophe for many of those around him whom he inadvertently destroys. Now, that's the first personal Faustian bargain. The parallel national Faustian bargain comes through the story of the narrator, Serenus. Now, the narrator is a modest classics teacher, but he quits his job during the Nazi period because he disagrees with the policies constraining the Jews. And in his retirements, he starts a secret memoir about his friend. Adrian's modernistic 12-tone compositions are suppressed under the Nazi regime. Serenus is afraid that Adrian's life work will go unnoticed and be forgotten. So, like Mann, the novel's narrator has a deep love for the admirable traditions of his country. He's enthusiastic about the start of World War I. He thinks it will bring a breakthrough in culture and a reform of the authoritarian German state. He understands the moral and intellectual disillusionment that followed Versailles. By describing the social milieu of his composer friend in the interwar period, Serenus exposes a culture suffused with Nietzsche's philosophy of the will to power. He takes us along for the conversation of irresponsible intellectuals at dinner parties who spout power theories, aesthetes who talk about the beauty of violence, blood, and soil, bourgeois pillars of society extolling barbarism and the Aryan legacy. They have no intellectual depth or moral subtlety. The story of this period shows how it was possible for a weak and humiliated, but nonetheless highly cultured and highly educated nation to degenerate into fascism. Next slide, please. Germany cannot resist the urge to regain pride and power after World War I. And like Faust, in other words, it is frustrated in its aspirations and therefore it is ripe for temptation. So Germany becomes more provincial, more aggressive, and consequently much more hated. And paradoxically, it was seeking to reestablish itself as a viable European nation state. So the humiliation after World War II is far worse than that following World War I. The outrages of the Holocaust shatter any moral claims Germany might ever have had. The cities and towns and all the traditional culture that they represent have been bound flat. Millions and millions are dead to no end, and this once proud culture is bankrupt. Mann clearly thinks that the election of Hitler is a Faustian bargain, one by which these intellectuals think themselves supermen. They sell the soul of their country in exchange for power. At first, in fact, Germany succeeds in conquering Europe. From the Baltic to the Adriatic, Germany triumphs. The flip side of this victory, however, is the rise of domestic terror and the metastasis of the cancer of the surveillance state. The narrator knows that the only real hope for Germany's soul is to lose the war and to submit to an unconditional surrender. And as Germany starts to lose, and as the war moves onto German soil, he sees with perfect clarity that defeat's inevitable and desirable. Just as Adrian cannot repent because he has willingly profited from his bargain, and moreover, he has persisted in it when he might have repented, Germany cannot help but fight the futile war to the end. She cannot let go of the doomed dogma of national superiority. The resulting physical and moral annihilation of the country becomes a living hell. Germany pays for its Faustian years of rejuvenation and triumph with damnation. Last slide, please. So in conclusion, we see that the Faust legend has had admirable staying power over the past 400 years. Every era seems to harbor material aspirations for which it is willing to sell its soul. The Faustian bargain has become something of a cliche, in fact, usually meaning someone has accepted some kind of corruption to get ahead in the world. There are a couple of constants, though. First, it is, of course, tragic to aspire to more than the mortal state will allow. And yet, it is part of our restless modern nature to do so. Second, the devil, however we think he should take shape, uses this tension against us and wedges his way in between what we want and what we can have. The will to power, to a great extent, the unspoken but dominant contemporary ideology that the Faust legend dramatizes, the will to power is by its very nature, tragic. It contains the paradox of endless human desire, the paradox of mortal aspiration for transcendence. These aims must inevitably step beyond human bounds. Paradoxically, as Goethe's Mephistopheles quips, modern people no longer believe in the evil one. He says, and I'll quote it in German because there's a pun here, ist schon lang ins Fabelbuch geschrieben. Allein die Menschen sind nicht besser dran, den Bösen sind sie los, die Bösen sind geblieben. Or, in English, the name Satan has been a myth for long. Not that man's any better off, the evil one they're rid of. Evil is still going strong. Der Böse is the German word for the evil one, a way of naming the devil. Despite the sea change in our minds, which transfigures Satan into a myth, evils nonetheless remain. In German, evils are die Böse, So we have made only a tiny lexical change in the definite article from the singular to the plural, from den Bösen to die Bösen. But we flatter ourselves to have escaped superstition. Really, the dramatist hints nothing's changed. Our psychologizing of evil, of internalizing the devil, has only switched the venue of the active combat for our souls. As a consequence, however, we've lost sight of the larger epic frame in which the unfathomable mortal tragedy is intelligible as a divine comedy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Let me just perhaps, Scott, you can override me here if you need to. Oh, but remove the spotlight for a second. So yeah, thank you. That was fascinating and so much to digest. I'm still trying to digest it. People who have questions can type them into the chat, and Rachel can communicate them. We've got 10 or no, about 15, almost 15 minutes to have a chat. I guess while people are thinking about that and writing down their questions, I wanted to take you back or ask you to go back a little bit to the original Faust book. And because when you were speaking at the end there about the about Germany, Nazi Germany, and that as kind of a national level manifestation of a Faustian bargain, I was wondering if in some ways it's going full circle to the kind of more purely moralistic version that existed right at the beginning. And that had me thinking, and perhaps you said this and I missed it, but could you say a little bit more about the source of the original story, what its roots are, just to kind of take us back to the beginning for a moment?
Sure, that's a nice question, Catherine. Thank you. The funny thing is that the new Lutheran theology opens up kind of new questions, and Luther says explicitly that all the Catholic saints are now going to be somehow they're banned, or we're not going to talk about Catholic saints anymore. Luther is against the whole idea of saints and worshiping saints. He thinks this is a kind of heresy. And so what happens, that the Lives of the Saints was one of the most popular books of the late Middle Ages and early modern period. So what we get here in the Lutheran sort of domain, or in the Reform areas of Europe, is a new kind of story. And what I find really fascinating is that this story about the sinner somehow replaces the old Catholic Lives of the Saints. And what I was trying to point out is that it has the same form. In other words, it's a kind of adventure story. You have a character who grows up with certain kinds of supernatural powers. Supernatural from a general point of view, that is. And then that person gets tempted and usually tortured to death, but they're miraculously saved. So this is kind of a new Lutheran or Protestant approach to the problem of telling an adventure story. But it has to, of course, from a theological point of view, takes the point of view of no, don't do that. The Catholic Lives of the Saints, of course, show all kinds of temptation and sin, but the saint always overcomes these. And again, the model is always from Jesus' temptation by the devil in Matthew. And I find that that's really interesting, that it goes back to the Bible, goes back to the New Testament, where that temptation is soundly rejected by Christ. But of course, for us mortals, we might not have that power. And so I think that's the sort of, if you will, the prompting of this new domain of story. The other thing that's really interesting is that it's also quite close to the development of the printing press. So a chapbook is a new thing in the 15th century, right? So in the period of Luther and in the period just following his birth and the development of Lutheran theology, the printing press is new. And of course, the printing of the Bible is, of course, one of Luther's major contributions. So Luther's Bible is one of the foundations of the whole German language. So people usually say that the foundations of German language as we know it today would be Luther's Bible and Goethe's poetry.
That's really interesting. We have a couple questions in the chat. One is from Tim Gosling. Tim, are you on? You can ask your own question if you would like to pop on for a second.
Hello.
Hi,
Can you hear me?
I can hear you. I can't see you though. I don't
Okay,
know.
I'll try to get my video. I don't know if you might not be able to see me. Anyways, I'd like to know anything you've got about the puppet tradition with Faust. I did do a puppet show at a thing called the Faustival at the University of Calgary many years ago. And it was such a gas to take Faust Part 1 and do a sort of shadow live video show for all these Faust scholars. But I never really quite understood. It seemed to me that Goethe was actually inspired by the Faust puppet shows. Is that correct?
Yes, I think that's quite correct, and I think that's a wonderful thing for you to be doing. So quite good on you. Goethe had, and he talks about in his autobiography, he had a puppet theater that was given to him, I think, by his grandparents. He was well-to-do bourgeois in Frankfurt. You can go visit his house today. It's been, they disassembled it in World War II piece by piece because they knew it was going to be bombed, and then they rebuilt it piece by piece after the war. So you can go see his original house, which still exists, and the puppet theater is there. So you can go see Goethe's puppet theater if you like. And he used to play with this as one of his favorite toys, and he talks about this as the beginning of his start as a dramatist. He used to play with his sister, and they would make up puppet shows all the time. So the puppet theater, I mean, as sure you know, and you could probably tell us, I mean, we see this really rarely today. And so I think it's really great that you're doing that. Maybe you can pick up a Punch and Judy show somewhere in some park in Europe, but it's really rare. I mean, it's obviously been replaced by very fancy media that we have, but this was a very popular, very popular, media for most people. And it's kind of crude, but it's actually very fun. So I don't know what your experience is. How did that go when you did that?
Well, it was great. Actually, in Victoria, there's at least two of us that have done shows based on Faust. The one I did, I was really hoping, my wife is German, and we were hoping to take it over to Germany. But because Faust is so sacred there, they didn't really like the humorous take that we had done on it. But the scholars loved it because they were always dealing with the serious take on Faust. So it's a great story.
It's so serious in Germany that I would think that most kids who, of course, were forced to read it would love to see a satire of it. They would love that. But,
yeah, that's right.
It's their teachers that might have a harder time.
Well, it's probably hard to teach. The language isn't easy for high school students.
Thank you. We've got 3 more questions, so let's see if we can squeeze them in. I'll ask the first one, perhaps just in the interest of time, because it's written out. Jessica, one of our graduate fellows, asks, I'm curious to hear that the consequence of Faust's deal is not limited to his damnation, rather it includes harm to so many others, and that this persists in the Faust story in the 20th century. Do you think it's moral then is a comment on the sin of individualism, that his sin is not to think that his behavior will not affect others?
Yes, that's actually a lovely reading, and I think that that's correct. It often isn't read that way. I mean, when you look at it, it doesn't look like Faust himself suffers, and so you sit there and you think, well, what's the tragedy? But of course, he ruins Gretchen. I mean, in Goethe's version, he ruins Gretchen and her entire family. They're just destroyed. And in Thomas Mann's version, of course, Germany itself is completely destroyed. And in Thomas Mann's version, also, as far as the composer is concerned, everybody that he loves is killed by the devil in various subplots. And so, yes, I think it's a very strong part of the theme, is that this idea that one could accrue all this power through magic. Today we call that technology, but that you could accrue all this power through magic has all these terrible consequences for other people. And Faust, of course, begins to realize this, but of course, the nature of tragedy is that you always realize this too late.
Thank you. Next, we have John Tatamanal. John, do you want to ask your question?
Sure. Jim, this was fantastic. I'm gathering that this is a formalized version of a coffee talk that I heard Paul raving about some time ago. My question is this, and it's hard to formulate because I don't have it precisely in my mind. Here it is, as best as I can do now. The structure of what counts as wrong or evil or sinful necessarily changes across the telling of these different narratives. I mean, the skeletal framework, as you say, remains.
Mm-hmm.
But to the extent that, God disappears and even the devil disappears, necessarily what counts as sinful, even the word sinful, can't quite take, right? Because something theological is implicit in the word,
right?
Explicit in the word. So I'm guessing the word sin drops out in Thomas Mann's way of telling the story. But that raises a further question, namely, it's not just a theological language that surely disappears, but even the possibility of articulating what counts as really evil.
Mm-hmm.
And you would think that perhaps in a more modern, contemporary, relativistic frame, it would even get hard to spell out what would count as like really, really wrong. And yet it seems pretty clear, at least with the Hitler and Nazi comparison, that there is a very non-relativistic conception of evil at work all the way through, even into Mann. Could you just say something about that? How is that? I mean, I was kind of surprised that we still have a strong conception of evil at work, even after God and the devil have vanished into thin air.
Yeah, very nice question, John. Thank you. I knew I could count on you for that. That's good. So I've done Thomas Mann a bit of a disservice. It's a 700-page novel, and in fact, it's kind of a slog. He drags you through the entire theology, and I didn't replicate that here for you. And maybe that's a mistake of mine. He's got this theology down, and he spells it out for you in great detail. Like, we follow the composer through his education at Wittenberg. Of course, the same university as always, the Lutheran University. So we do get a big dose of that, in fact, and we get a lot of talk about what evil and what the devil really mean. So it hasn't really gone away. It's been made contemporary, and it's done in extreme detail, just like the music theory likewise has been expanded in extreme detail. I mean, it's really hard for a non-specialist even to follow. So it's partly my fault, John, that there's not a good explication of what evil is. But in general, I think your point is really excellent. And that is that we might think that with our sort of relativistic moral points of view, that, evil just goes away, because that would, of course, be that's the problem of relativism, of course. And yet these authors are telling us, and I think you already made this point, but it's a good one and it's worth repeating. No, people know when their loved ones are crushed, when their country is crushed. They know it's wrong. I mean, in other words, that there's some limits here where relativism just doesn't even reach. And we know that, and it doesn't really take a huge amount of insight to be able to see that. But you can develop that in great depth over the course of a big novel. 700 pages is a big one. And so he does develop that really in quite a lot of depth. So we get to see the whole spin out, the consequences of this composer's choices. And we learn just all the terrible things that happen. So we're following from a privileged point of view, like what happens, which the composer himself doesn't even know, of course, but we're getting it from a sort of superior third person narrator point of view. But that's a really nice point. Yes, I think that is a consequence. We think we would know what evil is, and yet we don't really know even how to talk about it. So that's maybe a contribution that I'm trying to make.
Thank you. And thank you for all the great questions. I know that there are other people with questions and other questions still formulating in people's minds from the richness of that talk, but we're unfortunately at the end of our time for this evening. So let me take this opportunity to thank Jim again for being with us, for delivering such a rich and well-prepared and well thought out lecture. It was really great. And yeah, we're glad to have you with us tonight. So
Yeah,
thank you for that. I'll just ask Asia to put up the slide for next week so that I can announce that we have another exciting lecture next week entitled Sacred Sites as Public Sphere in Kashmir's Contentious Politics. We'll be hearing from Zora Batul, who has a PhD in political science from Jamia Millia Islamia in New Delhi, and from Rita Tremblay, who is familiar to some of us at UVic, Professor Emerita in the Department of Political Science. So we hope to see many of you there. And until then, have a good evening, and thanks again to Jim Cohn. Good night.
Bye.